It's really incredible how many vehicles have been destroyed on this route by now. The road of life has now become more like the road of death. May 27, 2026. We are in the 5th year, and this is day 94 since the start of the full-scale invasion. Welcome to the Situation Report. In today's report, we will once again look at attacks on the most important supply route for the Russians in southern Ukraine. What we will also look at, of course, are threats from the Russian side and many different attacks that Ukraine was able to carry out today, many of which are actually extremely interesting. By the way, Kimi 3663 and Belazabo 1 can get in touch with me. Both of them earned a 1 tactic medal each in the last Situation Report livestream on Monday. Please send me an email, then I can send it to you. So let's get started right away. Apparently, Russia is beginning to build the same political and propaganda architecture against the Baltic states that we have already seen in the conflicts in Georgia and later in Ukraine. This time, everything revolves around the issue of protecting the Russian-speaking minorities, a copy of what we've already seen in Ukraine. Moscow, of course, talks about Russophobia, discrimination, and alleged oppression of Russian native speakers in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. The Kremlin now says it will bring the case to the International Court of Justice. Excuse me at this point, but the real issue is less about the legal success of such lawsuits. Much more important is the story behind it. Russia is gradually building a narrative that claims it has exhausted all diplomatic means and was eventually forced to act, of course, through a military counterstrike. This exact pattern already existed in Georgia in 2008. Back then, Russia spent years talking about an alleged genocide against Ossetians, handed out Russian passports, and later declared that it simply had to protect Russian citizens. After that, the concept was even officially adopted into Russian law: military operations abroad to protect Russian citizens or Russian minorities. In Ukraine, practically the exact same process took place later, just on a larger scale. First, the protection of the Russian population, then some supposed Nazis, then genocide, and finally military intervention. Now you can see the same narrative appearing again in the Baltics. What's especially interesting is the timing. On the same day that Moscow announced it would take the matter to international courts, Putin signed a law allowing the use of Russian armed forces abroad to protect Russian citizens from courts whose jurisdiction Russia supposedly does not recognize. That seems less like a coincidence and more like an attempt to prepare a political and legal framework for future escalations in the long term. However, the big difference compared to Georgia or Ukraine remains NATO. Russia can't simply copy the same strategy in the Baltics. The Baltic states are NATO and EU members, which means any military escalation would carry a completely different risk. That's precisely why Moscow is probably aiming for something else at first: creating uncertainty, establishing political gray areas, and spreading the idea that there's an unresolved Russian problem in the Baltics. The situation with Russian supply routes in the south of occupied Ukraine is slowly becoming a real problem for the Russians. Along the roads between Donetsk, Mariupol, Melitopol, and also towards Crimea, the number of destroyed trucks and tankers is increasing to an extent that would have been hard to believe just a few months ago. I myself report on the situation almost every day, and viewers who are not watching for the first time today know this as well. But slowly, this farce is really getting out of hand, because what we can see in the daily videos of destroyed Russian vehicles are only those that have been recorded and published. So the actual losses could be significantly higher. The Ukrainian approach is particularly noticeable in this regard. Instead of identifying individual prestige targets and then attacking them, the focus is increasingly on everyday supply traffic. That's what hurts Russia most in the long run, because every destroyed fuel shipment, every lost military truck in Russia, and every driver who is out of action creates chain reactions along the entire frontline logistics. Transports are delayed, vehicles are missing elsewhere, and supplies have to be rerouted or secured more heavily. In addition, many insurance companies are not willing to cover the damages if you drive through a known danger zone. Alternatively, the premiums go up significantly. The fact that the first fuel rationing and price increases are now appearing even in Crimea shows that these attacks are slowly having real effects.
Wirkungen auf das Versorgungssystem haben.
The drones don't make the so-called road of life impassable, but they are increasingly turning it into a dangerous and very expensive route. All of this is shown on the situation map. Here I've drawn in the routes. The yellow ones are those that are attacked moderately often. So basically here, between the Russian border, Mariupol, and from Melitopol towards Crimea, there are an extremely high number of attacks here. Maybe even the most. They're up here in the north, from Mariupol as well as here towards Berdyansk, connecting to Melitopol, and also from Melitopol into the northern area. Most of it happens somewhere here in the triangle between Berdyansk, Mariupol, and the Tsar Train. You could almost call this the Bermuda Triangle of Ukraine. And there's a system to all of this. It's not a coincidence, because the Ukrainian Minister of Digital Transformation and Defense, Fedorov, has announced that Ukraine will massively expand its program to lock down Russian military logistics. This mainly refers to increased attacks deep behind the front lines, targeting warehouses, supply equipment, command posts, and logistical infrastructure in the rear area. And of course, also the road of life, which we have just looked at. Basically, Kiev is now openly confirming what has been increasingly evident for weeks. Ukraine is not just trying to hit individual prestige targets, but to slowly grind down the entire Russian supply system. Russia is being forced to devote more and more resources just to camouflage and the security of its logistics. And on the other hand, less and less is reaching the front. For lay people here, it may seem trivial whether some trucks are destroyed in the rear, as long as they can still keep firing at the front. But as Heinz Guderian already said, without logistics, there is no victory. General Barrow from the USA also said, and I quote, "Amateurs talk about tactics, but professionals study logistics." Even Sun Tzu wrote over 2,000 years ago in ancient China in his book The Art of War, "The line between order and chaos lies in logistics. An army without a baggage train, without provisions, and without supplies is lost." End of quote. And even though many things may change in war, yes, we always see new technologies, new tactics, and also new strategies. But one rule always remains the same. You can't win wars with logistics, but without logistics, you lose every single one. And since we're already talking about logistics, starting today, by the way, you can once again put the logistics of Deutsche Post in our country to the test. Because the new patches for the season are now available. Included is the new strictly limited War and Tactics special patch. This time featuring my character Eno, who can now join the Eagle one and the old patch. Furthermore, there's the standard channel logo patch, which, like many others, has already made its way to the peaks of our mountains and even to Ukraine. In addition, there's also the last stock of the Algo crew patches, and the new supporter patch for Patrick, who keeps driving the vehicles we've donated to Ukraine. Even now, when Russia is threatening that Kyiv should be evacuated, he is driving one of the donated cars there. And that's the important point. You can already buy the patches today and secure them before anyone else due to the limited edition. And Patrick will send them to you as soon as he returns from Ukraine. That's why shipping will take a little longer than usual. The link to the shop is in the video description. The Ukrainians have apparently hit another ship of the Buyan-class. At least 2 impacts are visible in the footage, and afterwards, parts of the superstructure caught fire. For the Russian Black Sea Fleet, or rather the Black-less Fleet, just a little joke, the situation is becoming increasingly uncomfortable. First, larger units had to be withdrawn from Sevastopol, and now even smaller ships are regularly coming under Ukrainian drone pressure. The Buyan ships do not play a minor role in this. The ships are used for missile operations and coastal security. Even damage to radar, communications, or fire control systems can significantly limit their operational capability. However, the ship that was hit was one that cannot carry Kaliber missiles. It's a different story here. For the first time, a Russian corvette of the Buyan-class has apparently been spotted in the Baltic Sea with additional anti-drone nets. These ones can carry missiles and were observed near Baltic, formerly known as Pillau. In the images, You can see that Russia is now apparently starting to secure warships in the Baltic Sea against possible Ukrainian drone attacks. We've just seen why that has become necessary. Such improvised protective measures have so far mainly been known from the Black Sea, where Ukrainian sea and air drones have been putting massive pressure on the Russian fleet for years. The fact that these measures are now appearing on Buyan-class corvettes in the Baltic Sea as well shows quite clearly how seriously Russia now takes the threat. The ships carry Caliber cruise missiles, and, despite their relatively small size, are among the most important platforms of the Russian Navy. While Russia continues to carry out airstrikes, this time a Shahed drone also struck right in the middle of a field in the Chernihiv region, right where a Ukrainian farmer was working with his tractor. The man was apparently just incredibly lucky. He was unharmed. That's a different side of the war, far from the front lines. Voronezh apparently became the target of a larger missile attack, possibly involving the use of Storm Shadow or, for example, Scalp cruise missiles. Smoke is rising over the Baltimore military airfield. Among other things, a Su-34 fighter-bomber squadron is stationed there, which Russia regularly uses for attacks against Ukraine. The local authorities claim that so far, only debris has fallen on a tire workshop. At the same time, the first reports indicate that these are actually areas of the airfield. In particular, the areas for maintenance, training, and technical repair are located in this direction. That would be much more problematic than just a mere hit on the runway itself. After all, aircraft can be relocated. However, workshops, spare parts warehouses, maintenance facilities, and technical infrastructure are harder to move. Baltimore is one of the most important Russian frontline airfields for operations against Ukraine. Especially there, the attacks with glide bombs play a central role. New footage from Ukrainian drone forces apparently shows heavy hits on an oil loading facility in Tuapse, in the Krasnodar region. Especially striking, in one of the videos, 2 drones hit almost simultaneously. In total, at least 3 larger fires can be seen. The damage appears to be significant. Loading facilities, pumping technology, and port infrastructure can't be replaced as easily as vehicles or warehouses. Many of these systems require specialized technology and spare parts, which Russia can often only obtain from abroad through indirect means. The coordination of the attacks is also interesting. Simultaneous strikes indicate that Ukraine is making its drone attacks increasingly precise and using complex attack patterns to overwhelm air defenses and outpace response times. And this is exactly where a clear trend in this war can now be seen. Ukraine has evolved in the drone war from improvised individual attacks to systematic deep strikes against Russian infrastructure. We've been seeing this very strongly since the beginning of 2026. These are the modified FP2 drones that we saw in the situation report about 2 weeks ago. In the first pictures, you can now see for the first time the modification with 8 mounted S-5 rockets under the wings. A few weeks ago, a video from the onboard camera of such a drone appeared, showing it firing a salvo at a communications node of the Black Sea Fleet in Crimea. Back then, you could only see the targeting view and the rockets themselves. What the modification of the FP2 actually looks like was practically unknown until now. What stands out the most is how large the drone has become by now. If we look at the FP2 at the beginning of the war, this is already a big difference. By now, it looks more like a small unmanned light attack aircraft than a classic FPV drone. With that, I want to thank all subscribers, channel members, and the LG crew. A special thanks goes to Lieutenant Colonel Drenica, Scylla, Dietrich, Freddie, and Mayor Hofer. Please subscribe, like, comment, and see you in the next report.